We go to Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and bearing with us. It's really important. What Mr. Conley was saying, I think it's essential to remember that I think when our founders were writing the Constitution, they understood that you cannot have 535 commanders-in-chief because we never agree with anybody. We can debate things and everything else, but the reality is when it comes to making decisive decisions overseas, time-reactive decisions, destroying an enemy, that can only be invested in one person, and that is the President of the United States. I actually would agree with the judge. I'm not sure that the War Powers Act would pass the constitutional test. But our power is to simply declare, I believe, that a state of war exists, I think, as enumerated in the Constitution, and then we can have power through appropriating money, et cetera. I was very concerned when a colleague of mine attempted to basically withdraw the current AUMFs out of provision because, as was discussed a little earlier, I fear that that would have immediately, I mean, if we believe that we can debate and pass a new AUMF in 6 months, I want to point to sequester and some of these other things in Congress that we've taken up to the time limit and actually not been able to successfully do, compel us to an answer. And I would hate to think that, so I'm an Air Force pilot, I'd hate to think that my colleagues would one day wake up and not have the legal authority to destroy our main enemy. And that's frankly what we would run into. I do support a new AUMF in the current construct where we're at, but I don't think there can be any time limit on it, and there can be no limitation on what the president can do because that makes us commander-in-chief. And I think what's being missed in all of this is ISIS, yes, ISIS is an enemy. This is a generational fight that we're in against terrorism. This is not just about destroying troops on the battlefield now, which is extremely essential to do, but this is about understanding that hard and soft power come into play here, and that this fight, this military fight, I truly believe will be going on for the rest of my life to some extent. And so the 7- and 8-year-olds in the refugee camps today are the ones we need to be focusing on to deny ISIS or the next generation of ISIS or whatever we call them, their ability to recruit their next recruits. So, General, I want to ask you, as I mentioned,
would my friend yield?
I support a new, yes.
I real briefly, and I respect you. I would say that what you've just enumerated is unlimited power delegated, in my opinion, unconstitutionally to the executive. You took issue with the expression of our power and the War Powers Act being constitutional or not. Right. What you've just said, if we acted on, would be an unprecedented delegation of power to the executive, and virtually conceding our war powers power.
And I appreciate
I thank my friend for yielding.
I appreciate that. But I believe that when you put 535 members of Congress into the commander-in-chief seat, and you state you have an enemy, we have an enemy right now, which is terrorism. So we give the president the authority to destroy terrorists, and we can't put a time limit on it because we don't know how long it's going to take. It's the internally displaced refugees now that are prime recruiting ground if we don't give them hope and opportunity. So, General, just to ask you, if we tie the hands of the president and the military by putting restrictions in the AUMF, or we sunset the provision, do you think that will have negative repercussions on the overall fight against this in this war?
Well, yes, sir, it could. I mean, it depends on what those restrictions are. For example, if you put a 5-year sunset on it, it certainly wouldn't restrict operations for the first 4 years and 364 days. But then if there's not a new AUMF in place to replace it, then if it sunsets and expires, then that would create issues. If you wrote in provisions, some of which I mentioned some examples in my testimony, for example, a no boots on the ground, or you can only no enduring large-scale combat, then those restrict the ability of the president, military commanders to plan, and they would have to plan operations that were consistent with the AUMF, and it might take options off the table that they needed.
And one of the things General, as I do, as everybody here does, no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. So you never know what you need or what you don't need. And so our job through the construct of the War Powers Act, which hasn't been thrown out by the court, so I accept it, is to give the president the authority to declare war on our end, to say that a state of war exists, and give him the authority to do what he needs to do. Judge, I know you talked about this earlier. I wasn't here, and I apologize. So maybe you're repeating yourself, but can you talk about what would happen the moment these current 2003 and 2001 AUMFs are rescinded? What would be the legal implications?
Well, I think questions would be raised principally about detention, since that is where the law where the rubber meets the road. As far as ongoing military operations, obviously there would be a debate about that, there would be uncertainty about that, but although the discussion before began the analysis of Article 2 powers at Section 2, I would go back to Article 2, Section 1, which begins with the words, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States." It doesn't say all except a little bit of it, doesn't say these particular instances of it, it says the executive power. That means all of it.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you.